Sunday Talks with the Marshmallow Man.
Hi, I'm Ossie from Three Monkeys Solderless, home of the world's best cables for your pedal board for both audio and DC. All kinds of colors. Check us out, threemonkeyssolderless.com. So we're back on Sunday, doing the Sunday Amp Talks with the Marshmallow Man, so to speak. So we got some interesting stuff, I guess, this week to look into. We got in the comment section from last week's video. So I figured we'll go through those, and we'll probably spend most of the time on one particular question, which is, what was that knob on the back of Ed's amp that was there and then wasn't there? What was that thing about? So we'll look at that a little bit. But first, we're going to go through some of the earlier questions and get those done, and we'll be able to move on from there. All right, so I'm pulling up the YouTube channel and the comments from last week. Try and move everything out of the way here so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so the first one is from Sligary. That's Scott. Hey, Scott. Believe it was Chris Marin from the forums who makes custom Van Halen related transformers. Yes, I've obviously heard of Chris Marin. I know he was winding transformers. I think he still has his website up. Someone wanted to try one out, so I tried to contact him to get a transformer, but never really heard anything back. So I don't know if anybody knows if he's still around, if he's still doing things, but I've heard good things about him. So not sure what that was related to from last month. Oh, okay. I think that is now I'm remembering a conversation offline. So that would have been the modification for running a resistor on the primary side of the output transformer to change the impedance, sort of reflected impedance in the loading on those tubes to create more compression and lower volume, right? So it was Chris Marin that is being credited for that particular thing. Yeah, so very well. Cool. All right, so Johnny Bean. What's up, Johnny? Once again, you're in California. You go on so late, and I'm so old. I go to bed so early. It's awful, but I got to get on your show. Just in the comment section, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get on video-wise. I'd have to have some assistance to get that going on. If I could build you a computer, I just don't know how to use one. All right. That's the way it usually goes. I could build you a system. I could take a bunch of relays, right, and stack them all up on a wall and start building you like a basic system of logic. And we could make some like really rudimentary calculations with the thing. But to get myself on YouTube is pretty complicated. So we all have our crosses to bear. But Johnny, we'll get it together, I promise. I got to definitely do it. Okay, next, Jimmy DeVere. Hey, Jimmy. This question is, hey, Ozzy, in the last mention, you had mentioned using all of the winds on the transformer using 220V. All right. I am wondering, and before you answer, let's just treat this as a theoretical question. And I'm not asking about my situation per se, nor holding anyone responsible except for myself. Yes. Anything that you see me do, don't do it. All right. Just don't do it. All right. Unless you're prepared to suffer consequences, just don't do it. Just treat everything that I say and do as like a educational thing. It's not meant as advice or instructions. All right, so I covered myself legally, I hope. But if someone wanted to try this using a step-up transformer to 220, do you think it would be possible to run a voltage reducer prior to the step-up transformer? I got to expand it out. Prior to the step-out transformer, not a Variac, but brown box type. And secondly, if someone wanted to have a custom transformer built, would they need to have electrical specs, or could they describe the general desired characteristics, if that would be enough? And lastly, most modern Marshall copy transformers seem to be designed to run off higher modern wall voltages. I assume he's talking about 120 versus 110. Do you have any thoughts of how that may have or may not change the sound and the tone? Thanks. Okay, so let's just take it one step at a time. if someone tried this, you get a step-up transformer to 220. It's impossible to run a voltage reducer prior to the step-up transformer. Yeah, this, I'm not sure what you're trying to do. I'll go through a couple of possibilities. All right, so let's say if you wanted to run a step-up transformer that was connected to a variac, right? So you would have the wall outlet that's 120, variac, and then you plug in a step-up transformer to the variac, and then you can mess with that. Yeah, you can do that. I've done that. Like I said, don't do it. But yes, that should work. Everything being, safe and working properly, and you have knowledge of what's going on there. Yes, that should work. Yes, to reduce prior to the, not a variac, but a brown box type. So I know of the brown box. I think it just brings the wall voltage to 110, right? So you would be basically giving a 110 supply to a 220 input. I would check with Pat at Brown Box and see what he says about that, just to be sure. But I assume it should work fine. I assume that. Or remember what Felix Unger said, when you assume, right? So check with Pat first and see what he says. Right, next, if someone wanted to have a custom transformer built, would they need to have an electrical spec, or could they describe the general desired characteristics? Well, that depends upon who's making the transformer, right? A lot of places are of the opinion that you pay them to do and not to think, right? And that makes sense, right? Because it's time is money in these days. So if you kind of like, I want to do this, and how do I do it? If it's something that deviates greatly from what they're used to doing and do all the time, then I would think you would want to provide them with as much technical specifications as you can, right? And then see if that's good enough for them. But every transformer company operates a little bit differently, right? Some of them are very much like they'll work with you, right? You could go to probably Mercury. It's been a while since I've talked to those guys, but Sergio over there was, a designer of transformers, and he was very, I've heard, very helpful with people who wanted to, monkey around with things a little bit and change some aspects, or had an idea of what would this do, and can you figure out a way to make something for me that would accomplish what I'm thinking of. So he might be able to do something like that. Haybower is a great transformer company. I love them a lot. I usually provide them with something, so they have something to work off of, so they don't have to do a whole lot. But that all depends upon who you're working with. But in general, if you're really trying to get something that you know exactly what you're trying to get, then you should know sort of what the specs are, right? Because it would be kind of difficult to say, I want this. Well, what is it? And you don't know what it is. First, you got to know what you're trying to make before you can actually make it, right? Seems logical. So if you're pretty much dialed in on what this transformer has to do, like how it loads, right? What kind of sag it's going to present under certain conditions, right? That's going to have an effect, and you're going to need to express that in a way that they're going to be able to understand. So yeah, as much as you could figure out what you're trying to do, I would provide them with as much information as possible and see what they say. Lastly, would most modern Marshall copy transformers seem to be designed to run off higher modern voltages, 120 versus 110? Do you have any thoughts of how that may or may not change the sound or the tone? Well, okay, so if you go back in time, right, and you've got your old amplifier, like one of the ones on the back, a 60s amp that has a 110 tap, and you plug it into 120, right, you're going to get 10 volts higher, which will raise your B+, right? It's just going to do that. But it's expecting to see 110, it sees 120, that's 10 more volts. So, you're going to be looking at, 20 more volts or something like that. I'm just doing that off the top of my head. All right, but basically you can multiply that by 1.4135 and figure out what more you're going to get, or as a percentage of 120. But anyway, you could do the math and figure that out. Now, will it change the tone? A little bit. All things being equal, nothing's the same. It's got to do something. Whether or not it's a big deal, I don't know. I think a lot of people have seen, improvements in their tone on their old amplifiers by using Pat's Brown box, right, which is supposed to bring the level down. Now, I haven't used it, so I'm not exactly sure exactly what the sonic differences are in that. I'm not exactly sure what's in Pat's Brown box, right, if it has a way of, in itself, limiting current, which could create more sag in the amplifier, right? I mean, that's also a possibility. For instance, let's say you were to take a smaller transformer, like power transformer, okay? That's really meant to run, let's say 1 amp output, right? Let's like it's a step down or a step down transformer, right? Or a step up transformer, but with multiple taps on it. And you were to connect that to this, to use that as the step up between the wall outlet and the amplifier, right? So you would have like this surrogate transformer, right? That was only rated for like 2 amps, and you plugged a 100-watt amp into there. The amp is going to perform differently. That little transformer is going to get a little hot, and if it survives, you might enjoy the sound. It's possible, right? So I don't know exactly what Pat's Brown box is, so I couldn't really comment intelligently on whether it's, there's a technical reason for why your amplifier would sound different with that, other than, a small voltage drop. The voltage drop is also present on the heaters, but that becomes even more and more insignificant than the B plus is, considering it's only 10 volts. Okay. Also, be interesting to hear more about your bio, where you're coming from, experiences and stories from the industry, guitar and amp building. Yeah, I mean, it's been, decades of doing this, and I've met all kinds of people, famous people, not famous people, runs the gamut. I've seen a lot of crazy stuff, right? I've been in a lot of cool places. I've seen a lot of interesting things. I've learned a tremendous amount from all of those experiences. I mean, even when you think you can't learn something, you're learning something, So, as I usually throw something in if something becomes relevant to the topic we're talking about and makes sense that it fits in with the idea I'm trying to express. And there was something that happened in my experience that I saw. I'll always include that, but just blabbing, incessantly about, there was this time I was hanging out with, I don't know if I could do that. That doesn't strike me as very fun, but there's a lot of, met so many interesting people. I mean, I suppose, I've only had my experiences, so I don't know what another life is like. So, but I assume that, as always, life is how you see it, how you interpret it. And I can imagine that no matter what I would have done, I think I would be feeling the same way. That I've met a lot of people that are very interesting. If I decided to go, to medical school, I'm sure I'd have a ton of stories too. If I decided to go to law school, I'm sure I would have had a ton of stories. But I decided to do this for whatever godforsaken reason. Oh, sorry, Mom. Anyway, all right. So let's keep going. Fascinating discussion on necks. Very noticeable. What was your conclusion in terms of preference for the necks? My preference for things, as always, with everybody else, seems to change, right? But I like Warmoth and I like Mighty Mite. Those seems to be the two that I like. I like all parts necks too for like vintage Strat builds. If you're just need something off the shelf, but I guess there's a lot of companies out there that make things, and then I make my own necks too. So they all come out a little differently too. But those are some good things. Can't go wrong with Mighty Mite, Warmoth. All parts. Also, Musicraft is great. Scott over there, great stuff. Right? I can't recommend them highly enough. Okay. All right. So now we're going to go to like the bigger question, which was from Johnny Echo. All right. Let me get a drink. Some of the pig drink. Right. Got to have that. What do you think the white knob on the back of Ed's Plexi was? Jose Master, line out volume, bias pot? Does it seem reasonable that Ed adjusted the bias by ear? Okay. So I'm assuming anybody that's watching this probably has seen the pictures of Eddie's amplifier, right? But I grabbed a chassis. It's not a 68 chassis, but it's close enough, right? So here I've got this chassis right here, and let me get my frame out a little bit better so I can see what I'm showing you guys. So this is like basically a Marshall chassis, right? It has, it's more of a 70s model because it has the rocker switches on it, but basically everything is where it should be in the same way like a 60s Plexi would be, like a 68, 69, right? So what we're most concerned with would be the location, right? So from pictures of Ed's amp, let me see if I can get this into frame better and hold it in a way that's not driving me nuts, right? All right, so anyway, there's 4 preamp sockets on this, right? Which would have been the same thing on a 60s Plexi, right? So the 4 preamp sockets were used for, tremolo or anything else they might have done around those times, right? This particular socket, the first one, would have usually had or would have had a plate on it, right? And that would have been like a steel plate with a couple of brass screws that were holding in place to block off the hole, right? Leaving you the 3 sockets for a super lead circuit. Now, that hole in the back of Eddie's amplifier, which was there, right? And we could see in studio pics, especially the one which was kind of staged in Studio 2, I believe it was, at or Studio B at Sunset. It shows the hole right over this tube socket, right? So it would have been right about here, right? So it would have been located somewhere in this area, exactly here, right? So that should give you some, it can give you some idea of what it may or may not have done. Now, let's first say that we're never going to know probably what was there until somebody spills the beans, right? That had to be around in the 70s, and maybe it was still there in the 80s. I don't know. But, as time went on, that amplifier got worked on by a lot of people, right? It went to Holland. It got totally rebuilt. Many people had been through many hands, right? So any descriptions of the amplifier, let's say that happened in the 90s or whatever, probably will not give you an idea of what it was like in the 70s, right? Because the thing had been rebuilt so many times and messed with. Who knows, right? So I don't put a whole lot of stock in, eyewitness accounts of I've seen the amp, because I haven't heard of anybody who's seen it as it was, on the first album, so, or second, right? So that's the case. So anyway, let's go back to what it could be. All right, so there's possibilities, right? There are limited possibilities of what this thing could be. So we can kind of put those out there, and then we could decide, are these things likely or not? And then you can make up your own mind, right, as to which one you think it is. Okay, so let's go through what they could be. Could it be, let's see what the first thing was, a Jose Master. Okay, so a Jose Master basically is a type of master volume that would be on the cathode follower of the tone stack, is where it's located, right? Which would be this tube right here, right? So if I were to modify an amplifier, right, I would consider putting that master volume as close as possible to where the circuit is, right? To where what you're working on it is, because you don't want to use a lot of wire, right, to carry signal around inside an amplifier, right? Because lead dress is important. If you're to run wires all over the place, they're all going to start picking up RF or different frequencies that you don't want, which could create all kinds of problems in the amp, right? It could be helpful in some cases. In some cases, it's just going to create something that oscillates or is noisy, hums, squeals, all kinds of nonsense. So being that, the thing was over here and, the pot was over here, it's not the best location, right? Could it be that whoever drilled the hole didn't give a crap and was just drilling holes, was like, where should I put it? I'm just going to put it where when I drill, it's not going to drop a lot of metal all over the place and it's a good spot. That's possible, right? The other thing is, and I'm going to go and look at a picture real quick of the back of Eddie's amplifier, right? Just so I can refresh my memory. Now also too, all right, so Now, what I wanted to see, which I couldn't quite remember, is how many speaker jacks were on the back of his amp, right? Because here we have these two here, right, which would be, which were not on his amplifier. So just these two. So there was available room to put a Jose Master where it should be. And I've seen also other modded Marshalls that Jose did to put the Master in where it was over here. All right. So, you know, he had put it here on a lot of amps. I've never seen a Jose, and I haven't seen a lot of them, like a ton of them, because there aren't a ton of them, but I haven't seen one with it here. So was it a Jose Master? I don't think so. And plus, I don't see a reason for it. You know, I think on a non-modified amplifier, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a pre-phase inverter master. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to have a post-phase inverter master either, because that really does limit the drive to those power tubes, which is where all the good stuff happens, right? So I don't see there as being a master volume on his amplifiers when they were stock. I'm still of the opinion that slaving was important there, right? But could be things that happened alongside slaving, right? So let's continue on with other possibilities. Was it a line out? Okay, that's possible, right? So you would run a line out, right, which would be taking the signal from the output jacks, you know, way over here, right, and running it across the chassis all the way over to here. And that would be the output, right, which is a fairly strong signal. And it's going to come close to, you know, some of these grids on the input. I think you could avoid having crosstalk there, and it could possibly, you know, work fine in that position. The other thing is, where's the jack for the line out, right? So if you were to make a line out, you would probably put the jack for the line out close to the potentiometer that you were using to vary it, right? So it doesn't make a lot of sense that would be a line out way over here. Now, I have seen amplifiers where they've decided, you know, to put all kinds of weird switching type systems up here on jacks, right? That they would defeat some jacks and unwire them and use them for other purposes. But that, considering you would put a line out to go so close to the input, that doesn't sound like a great idea unless you were to flip the phase. But even then, I don't think that's something I would do. It just wouldn't make a lot of sense to have the output of the amps, you know, a wire containing that signal so close to the inputs of the amplifier. It just doesn't make sense to me. I'm not saying you couldn't do it and get away with it, but it seems like I'm going to make this as hard as possible for myself and make it, you know, so I have to really work at it possibly to get this thing to not oscillate. All right. So line out, I don't see it as the line out. That just doesn't make sense to me, its location. Bias pot. Okay. Now, if it were a bias pot, now let's say the board would be located in this area, right? And the bias adjustment would probably be somewhere right around here, okay? That's probably where the bias pot is, somewhere in that general area. So for that, once again, you're going to have to run some very long leads to get back all the way over, you know, to, I hate being dyslexic, over here, okay? So that is the case, right? If it were a bias pot, that's a long way away from where it would need to be. If I was going to, just someone said, put in a variable bias pot for me that I could adjust, I'd probably put it, you know, pretty close to the speaker jacks right there. I might even opt to put it on top. That might be better. That's probably where I would recommend putting it, would be on top of the chassis, so you just can't, you know, accidentally move it and screw everything up. Or, you know, have the thing, you know, moved and you don't know it and your amp blows up. All right. So a bias pot, I don't know. Does it seem reasonable that Ed adjusted the bias by ear? Well, we'll talk about that right now while we're talking about bias. It does seem reasonable. I mean, I think every guitar player has probably done that, maybe, if they're, you know, sort of figured it out. I remember when I was a kid, this was, you know, because I was always into electronics or whatever. And I had gotten, it was a Fender amp of some sort. I don't remember which model it was. It was a junky old Fender amp, and there was a knob on the top, right, of the chassis. And I was like, before I opened it up, before I was really getting into it, I'm pretty young, right? So I'm just like cranking on this thing to see what it would do. And I was like, it makes it louder and this makes it softer. So yeah, I would think probably everybody would have done that at some point. And I think it makes sense, right? Because in the end, what we're trying to do is make it sound good, right? And what good is up to your ears, and it's up to the individual's ears. So that's what I always like to do when I'm biasing something is I'll get it within spec so it's safe, and then I'll just start tweaking around with it till I'm happy and I like the sound the best in this place, and then I'll re-verify that it's not too bad. And sometimes, you know what, if you want to, it's going to be a little bit too hot. But if it's your amplifier and you're kind of watching it all the time, you can maybe get away with doing that and not destroy the thing. All right, so that does make sense. All right, so let's keep going on the ideas of what else this pot could be, right? What else could this pot be? Let me put the chassis down here. And I've got the some paper here too, so we could just... so we went through it was the Jose Master, the line out volume, the bias pot. Yeah. All right, so another possibility would be... Was there at all possible, and I won't discount anything, was there at all possible that there was some kind of cascade in this system, right? In Ed's amplifier. Now, if you were to once again look at the chassis, that fourth slot would be obviously very handy for stuffing another tube in, right? And then you could, if you were to put the circuitry for that tube, right, you would need a cathode resistor, right, which could be put like Jose used to do on a little tag strip that was, you know, sort of mounted right there. You would need a plate supply, which could be on that tag strip. And we've seen those in the Jose amplifiers, right? Jose's amps always had those little things there, right? The tag strips are very famous for that, and that he'd like to use. You would need also then a grid coupling capacitor, right? Or rather, excuse me, a coupling capacitor, right? So you could run the coupling capacitor right off the tube itself and onto that pot, which was mounted right there, right? And then you could bring it up to the board, and you could run it in a variety of ways, right? So for instance, let's look at ways that you could run that. All right, so let's say, all right, you would have, I'm just going to draw real quickly. You would have the jacks here, let's say 4 jacks. And here's your tube, and here's your tube, and here are okay. So these, let me get this into frame better, and I can kind of show you. All right, so these would be your 4 input jacks. These 2 V's right here would be the input grid resistors, right? The 68K input grid resistors. This tube over here would be the added tube that would normally have a plate over it. And this tube right here would be the normal first stage. Okay. So one of the things you could do is you could use, let's say, the input from any one of these. You would run that down, let's say from here. All right. You could run that down to here. You would have your pot obviously right here. Right. You have your pot, and you would have your lugs here. So then you would have, right, a little tag supply right here. So you would have a plate resistor, right? And then you would have your grid, which would be right here, right? And you would have your cathode resistor, which would be right here. That would go into ground. This one then would have a capacitor that you could use, right? Going into there, that would also be grounded. All right. So basically, you would have the input, your grid resistor right on the tube, right? Your cathode resistor going to the tag strip to ground. You would have your plate resistor, right? And this would obviously be going up to the B plus, right? Your capacitor, coupling capacitor for that would come over to the potentiometer that you installed right there, right? And then the output of that, you could run over to basically all of these if you wanted to, right? So you could disconnect all of these grid resistors, right? And you could, from their jacks, right? And you could run this up right across them, right? So then that would go into the second tube, right? So then you would have both channels working, right? So let's put in the potentiometers now of what would normally be there, right? So this would be the bright and this would be the normal, right? So you would have your same coupling capacitors, right? Which would be one here and one over here, all right? Well, let's just put them here. They're usually on the other side just for what you're talking about, right? So these would be your coupling capacitors, right? And they would go up to these pots. Right, so that could be one way that you could run the amplifier. So this would kind of be like jumping the channels, but having a boost before the input of the two jump channels, right? So if you were to sort of, let's say you were like using an EQ to boost the front end of a Marshall amp, and you would run them into both sides, right? And then adjust how much bass or treble you would want to use. This could be a possibility of how you could do that, but with a tube. Now, if you were to look at a later Jose modified amplifier, right, one that the mod that he would do the three-way, that was one available option of the three-ways, was that the added tube would boost both sides of the inputs, which was a really cool sound, right? Because you kind of got some hopped up kind of bassy and some bright, and you could kind of balance the two together, and they were boosted from the same source. So that is sort of like a possible Jose mod. Now, did that happen? I have no idea, right? I mean, his amplifier to me doesn't sound too much like that, but once again, I have to say everybody hears things a little bit differently, right? So some people are, they think there's a little bit more gain than the next person may think, right? So they would prefer to have, even if there was slaving, have a boosted Marshall as the first amplifier, right? And then going into the power amps. And that could really work, right? That would not negate the idea of, how you load these things to make them sound a little bit more compressed and make them kind of get more of a solid sound to them by changing the way the output transformer is loaded and lowering the voltages with, a variac. So that does not preclude the solution of slaving or variacs or the load box itself or the way that it was run into the next head having an effect on the compression and tone. All right, so that's another possibility that maybe there was there. Then we can go into one more possibility, because we could see from some of the pictures, right, where the knob is there, right, that there is no tube. So that would mean that this isn't going to work, right? We see this or that it was changed over time, right? So maybe there was not this sort of like the beginnings of the three-way mod in there, all right? So there's another possibility. So let's look at that. All right, so like I said in the Van Halen 2 studio pics, you see the amplifier on the floor. It still has the knob in there, I believe, right? And the plate for that extra socket is intact. So, all right, we got to come up with maybe another solution. What's the next solution? Okay, the next solution would be, and I don't like it for the reason of where once again the location of that pod is, but we'll go through what the next thing could be. All right, so let's look at just the three tubes, right? So you have the phase inverter, right? You have the cathode follower, and you have the the first input stage. Okay, and then you would have the potentiometer right here once again. Okay, so we'll just draw all these guys here, and that's a grounded lug on our little pot on the back of the amp. Now I'm going to draw in really quickly like a cathode follower, which is the tone stack. All right, so let's draw in very quickly what a tone stack would look like. Okay, so these are your 0.02s. This is going up to here. Your 500 puff. Okay, and then on this cathode follower, you have your 100K, and then you would have this going to the B plus. Okay, and these are going to the bass, middle, and treble. Okay, B, M, T. Right, so we'll make our lugs of the bass, middle, and trebles. Right, okay, just to, I don't know, just to do it how it probably would work. Right, so we got this lug goes over to here, and this lug goes over to here. This is grounded, right, and then you have this going to here, this going to here, and this going to here, and then this goes to the phase inverter. Right. All right, so that's kind of that's what it looks like. Okay, so did I connect this? No, I didn't. All right, so these are connected to the cathodes, right? So this is your tone stack, right? And this is it's the cathode follower, it's called, and it's called that because the tube is arranged as a cathode follower, which means that the two triodes, right? A tube has two sections to it that are independent from one another and identical in a 12AX7, right? Which is your Marshall tube, right? So in a cathode follower, both sides are used to create a low impedance circuit that is capable of driving a tone circuit like a Marshall standard BMT, Fender Marshall Vox sort of tone circuit, right? What you could do is you could make this a plate-driven tone stack, okay? Instead of a cathode-driven tone stack. And that would free up one triode, right? So now you would have another stage to play with, okay? And that would require the use of a potentiometer there, okay? So what you would do, basically, is you would keep, let's say, just a couple of things here, right? You would restructure this tube with two 100K or whatever plate resistors you'd want to have, right? Off the B plus node. You would keep these cathodes for each side of the tube. You would change out this from like 100K to down whatever you wanted it to be, like 800. 800 ohm, 1K, 2K, whatever you're looking for in terms of, a swing on the plates. This could probably stay the same, right, as, like a 1K with a, a cathode bypass on it. You would disconnect, obviously, this portion right here, right? So you would have to put in another turret right here. This would go to here. This would get broken, right? And this would be connected to the plate supply on that side, and the other plate supply would go basically out to a capacitor once again, out to your pot, and then come back in to the other side, right? So I know this may be a little bit confusing because it's all muddled up, but basically what you would be doing is changing one half of this side, which is driving the tone stack, to a plate follower instead of a cathode follower, right? So you would have a plate resistor, and you would have a lower value cathode, right, instead of 100K or 1K or whatever it is. And then you would have the grid from this, or from the output from this, feeding that, right? So you would come from the volume controls into this stage. Well, let me draw it real quick. It's hard to kind of like just describe building this by eye, right? Or by word of mouth. So you would have, all right, so right here, let's say you have your mixer resistors, right? Right, and this one is the bright side, and this is not the bright side. Okay, so here you would have, I'm gonna make it bigger so you can see, you got your plate, you got your grid, you got your cathode, and on this side you got your plate, you got your grid, you got your cathode. All right. So you would have one resistor. And these, let's just make them 100 Ks, right? Okay. And they would both be basically fed, right, from the B plus. So you could put that on a little tag board as well on the and just screw it into one of the tube socket number 4 screws, right? So you'd have a place to put it. But anyway, you would take this once again. It would go into this side, this grid right here. So this would be your cathode, right, where we had the bypass from before, right? So this would come over here, and then you would take another capacitor, right? And this would feed our pot. Right? The output of this would then come to the grid here, and you could use a little resistor here, let's say like a 470K or whatever, right? And this cathode would go to here, right? And this would be like a 1K, all right? And then you would have your tone stack, your slope resistor, right? And that would be fed right off the plate. All right, so that's sort of what it would look like. Let me put the cap on this pen. That's sort of what it would look like, right? So you have your output of your mixer resistors, right, going into the grid of the first triode on that 12X7 that used to be the cathode follower, right? And then you would have the output of that through the coupling capacitor to the potentiometer, the output of that going into this side, the other side grid of the cathode follower spare triode. It'd be plate driven from this 100K, both from the same B plus node. And then it would be a plate driven. You'd have your 0.02, 0.02, 500 puff. And you would have your cathodes for both sides, a 1K and a 1K. And then you would have another gain stage that would also accept the sum of both channels. So you would be able to, once again, no matter which side you're sort of playing with on the amp, whether it be the normal or the bright side, they would both be being boosted. So it would be kind of like the same way as before, where you're able to affect both channels from the front. You would be able to affect the sum of both channels this way. And I think that's an interesting possibility, you know, because that means that you would still have the same amount, 3 preamp tubes. You wouldn't have to take that cover off. It would kind of explain why there's only one potentiometer there, you know, and where, you know, why there's no jack next to it. It would explain a lot of that stuff. The only part that I'm still keeps me from saying that has to be it is the location of that hole. You know, why put it over there? Well, I'd like to know too who did it, because maybe Jose didn't do it, because I did buy that amplifier when it was, I guess, being used at one of the places that he used to play at, and it was their house amplifier, as in something that anybody could plug into. All right, so maybe another local tech, you know, had done that modification to it to get it a little bit more grindy, you know. So those are the possibilities, I think, that would have been there. I mean, any of these things are possible, right? So, and in the end, it's up to the people that are using them, how they feel that sound. So I don't think there's any, until we know, there are no wrong answers, right? Until we know for certain what had happened, there are no wrong answers. I think we have some pieces that we can assume are pretty close to being, you know, were part of the equation. How they were all used, whether there was only a few of these techniques being used or all of these techniques being used, is still open for a possibility, right? Was the amplifier, did it have an additional gain stage like one of those two ideas? It very well could have, because it very well sounds like that. A lot of people think that just a straight plexi, even when you load it like this, still needs a little bit more, right? So that could be the possibility. Other people are like, no. So it's really up to your perception of how you hear it to put it all together in a way that satisfies your ear to get to where you want to go, right? So any of these things can work, and if you find one that works for you, then that's the right answer as far as I'm concerned, right? People are never going to agree on this. I think even if even if they were to invent a time machine and we were able to sneak into that room in 1978 and at night into the studio and open up the back of the amp and put it down there and take pictures of it and come back in time and show it, I think there would still be disagreement. So that's what we got for it. So anyway, I think that's good for today. Maybe that'll have some ideas for somebody. Maybe I should build one like that, with the plate driven and see what it sounds like. I mean, maybe I should do it, just see for the hell of it, and do it on this, because I still think that this is the way that it was done for me. All right. So, yeah, maybe that's something to be tried. So anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week. And if you have any more ideas or questions, put them down there, and maybe we'll try to come up with a single topic for each session, right, that we can expand upon, like the mystery knob or something like that. And if I come up with some more ideas for next week with the mystery knob, I'll talk about them too. Anyway, so thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.